almost 10 years ago now when we first went to do our first work with it, what was called ThoughtStream at the time. We were talking to an American superintendent, and he said to me, Dave, this work that you do with crowdsourcing, can you help me formulate and craft and ultimately pass a bond? And I said, yes, sir, absolutely. You're going to have to start though. What exactly is a bond? I don't understand anything about it. I'm a Canadian guy in a startup, and I have no idea even how their money flows in your system, in your state. And so we started to get education on how each state is different and how money flows and what the difference between an override and a levy is, and taxation and how that relates. In some places it's a millage, in some other places it's a taxed override, and some states are run largely on bonding, and some states have to go to the governor to ask for money, which is very much like Canada, and it's not an election at all. That said, there's something that has remained true throughout this, and I thought that it would be a useful context for me to share with you, is to actually connect the sides of the organizations that people are disproportionately concerned about money right now and how that relates. And I actually want to connect leadership to financial decisions, because I think where we started as a company was effectively a pretty big insight. If you ask people about what their priorities are and what they think about something, and if you're willing to change your mind about a funding scenario publicly because you learned something, the level of support that you will then get from those people is hard to describe. It's enormous, because people say, A, you bothered to ask, B, I saw you visibly learn something and change your mind in your budgeting process, and C, I just appreciated your process so much, even though I don't agree with everything you said. The amount of buy-in that I have, that's actually how we were able to get successfully launched as a company, not because we made the best decisions. And I'm going to unpack that for you just in a 5-minute presentation. Some of you have seen a piece of this before. It's been updated, so I apologize for the parts that are a repeat. But I actually want to talk about capital and expand a definition of capital for you. And capital is really all the assets that you have available for your purpose. And as everyone on this call well knows, there's a lot of ways to access capital. But I really want you to think about capital with a bit more of a broad distinction. This is our usage graph in Thoughtexchange since the outset of COVID. And I've been updating this. It's now closer to 600%. This is now a week old. What happened in the first week of COVID is that our usage went down. Everyone went home. We didn't know what was happening. A very terrifying moment. From then, this graph is 500%. It was year-over-year growth. It's 500% since the start of COVID now. When normally we'd grow 60% year over year, something like that. It's up 500% in the last 100 and something days. This is actually not just a brag about the company, but this is existing people using the product to actually create capital. And I'm going to unpack what I mean by that, and hopefully put it in a financial context that is valuable for you. Right now, with the amount of uncertainty, I want to talk about leadership capital as that relates to hearing from people, and hopefully, I see many of our customers using Thoughtexchange right now in order to create this leadership capital, and also contained in that graph is a pretty impressive percentage of districts that actually aren't. That since COVID happened, they haven't used Thoughtexchange because they're not exactly sure how. In this light, how do you do such a thing? So I'm hoping that I can shed some light and inspire some people through this thinking. So the challenge is something that I do not have to remind you of, except I'm only here to, this is actually so that you can gain confidence in me that I'm not completely out to lunch. That we're all aware that financial realities have changed from a slowdown to that tick recession, tick depression, maybe. And that learning is transforming. The only piece I want to drill down on here is that remote learning has happened. That becomes distributed learning, which is happening and might just maintain that way. And right beside that, as a person who created a disruptive company, that on everybody's mind should be the disruption that follows when things get shaken up, which means that, it used to be the brick and mortar charter schools used to be the thing that people talked about as a disruptor. And now online, there's parents, millions of parents that are educating their kids in their homes. And the opportunity for disruption is enormous right now to say, well, I don't know, why would you go back to school? And we can probably offer just as an example, a digital solution that then has a gathering mechanism using public spaces, whatever disruption you never expected, and then it happens. Of course, you talk about this, but I don't think this can be talked about enough. And the next one is that, of course, continuous change is imminent. There's funding and restructuring, just ultimately that same disruption. The more funding it cuts, the more people get moved around, the more disruption becomes possible. And if you haven't heard disruption in the context of a technology company, it's worth looking up, because effectively it just means that the ability to disrupt something is like a company like Airbnb becoming bigger than the biggest hotel companies in the world without ever having owned a single hotel. Now, really right now, that as budget leaders, that the choice is to insulate or innovate. And I want to talk about the sort of innovations that are possible through this. And I hope that this is an inspiring concept. The idea is that right now there's more crisis happening in your organizations than in recent memory. And this can either be the most tumultuous time in the world, but I just want you to focus on one piece, is that if you think in your mind of the best leaders that you've ever encountered, or you can actually use this exact same exercise on the strongest relationships you have in your life. What you do not do is say these people are actually the people that are only there during the upcycle, during the reactions, during the change, during all the exciting things that we're doing. You don't picture them there. You actually picture them at the bottom of the trough. You say that the best leaders were there for me during the crisis. In my relationships, the people that mean most to me were there for me in the hardest moments. They were also there at the top. I don't really remember them up there at the top, but I really remember them down there at the hard moments. And therefore, this moment, actually, a bit counterintuitively, is there is more opportunity for connection with your people, your constituency, your students than ever in the history of school districts and education. That this constant change has a constant opportunity to create leadership capital. And we're seeing that, and right within that chart is, for example, in the state of Connecticut, we hear from right now about 20,000 students talking about remote learning in order to educate teachers on what they like best. And that opportunity just hasn't existed before, because basically people have never actually taken that crisis to actually ask so many students what they think about education. And so there is a bit of a silver lining in these moments to be able to create connection. I want to unpack 3 kinds of social capital, and I think the last one will be the one that really is something I want you all to take something away from. But start with this one, which is social capital. Think about it as be that friend. I also interchangeably use like relationship capital with this. But the idea is this, and I really want you to encourage your respective organizations to picture that friend who you know every time they reach out, they want something, otherwise they would never call. This is, you know that person in your mind. You can picture them, you can picture their phone number, and you can picture your sigh when you're like, what do they want? And then you pick it up and you're like, yeah, hi, and the awkward 10-minute conversation, and then the ask. Versus that picture, that friend that you raced back in the good old days when we went out and bought lunch for people, when you raced to buy them lunch before they bought lunch for you. The difference between those two is a level of social capital or relationship capital. But the question that you should be asking yourself as an organization is, what events led up to you having that sort of capital in the bank for that person? And therefore, what ways can you actually create an unprecedented level of social capital in this time of unprecedented need? And I am, by the way, completely aware of, I'm just adding to the unprecedented number of times the word unprecedented has been used. I'm just trying to add to the tally. But the point here is actually that many school districts are actually a little bit guilty of this, organizations in general, of saying like, we reach out to do conversations around budgets when we are really wanting to pass our budget. And so the question is, if you need to talk to them about a budget, how early can you start to not talk about a budget? If you know you're going to have a major shortfall next year, what can you do now? And the sort of questions that you can ask now are actually things related to social capital. What challenges are you experiencing now? I'm actually not going to, because I know I need to ask you about money or restructuring or changes a year from now, I'm going to work really hard right now to not ask about those things. So I'm actually starting with the questions you should be asking that's not about money, because you need to be asking about money. And by the way, when I frame the context of asking for things, asking for acceptance of change is a thing. It doesn't have to be a tax override or actually money coming from the pocket of a taxpayer. It can be just accepting the fact that you're going to be reducing your services, or accepting the fact that you're going to be asking them to change their behavior. Another question is, if remote learning continues next year, what concerns, questions, or advice do you have? You know, this is the question we asked across the 20,000 students in Connecticut. What hopes and concerns do you have about the future? These are the sort of questions that a friend would ask, a leader would ask, that are no strings attached, that we really encourage all organizations to be asking. A, empathetically to understand what people think and feel, and B, to build that social capital so that by the time you actually need to ask, maybe for an election in order to do a budget override, that people feel like you asked them during the time of Black Lives Matter and during the time of COVID, you were really asking them about how they felt, and now you're in a spot where you need to be talking to them about a tax override, and they're going to repay you for that because you've become the sort of friend as an organization that is worthy of that. The next one, this is process capital, or as we say in Canada, process capital. Thought Matt Cole would appreciate that joke. This is the idea of this is never about me or about me without me. Never about me without me. This is a pretty core concept, and it resonates with what's happening in the world right now. But this is actually, I call this the crappy dinner syndrome. Humans are statistically more willing to embrace bad decisions with a good process than just a good decision. And this is actually, people have done studies by this. I think Harvard put the number 4.5 times more likely or something like this to accept a bad decision with a good process than vice versa. I don't know how they came up with that number. There's some science around it, I'm sure. But the idea is actually pretty intuitive. It's basically, if you're with a group of people and you all decide together, hey, where should we go? And you all, for some reason, end up at the Red Lobster. And you're like, well, that's fine. We had a great time. We had a fun dinner. And in fact, you're going to like your dinner better than if someone says, you know what, we're going here. And people say, I don't really want to go there. And they say, well, I'm driving, so we're going to go there. And then you go there. No one wanted to go there. You go there and you have the most amazing dinner in your life. You just know in your heart that people are going to complain about that dinner and they're not going to enjoy it. And in fact, I'll even assert that probably the food doesn't even taste as good, even though it could be by every measure better food. People just hate bad process. And so the decisions you're making right now as an organization, if your people don't feel like you've made a fair process around how you're making these budget decisions, it doesn't matter if you're making the best decisions. They would prefer that you made a worse decision but had a better process around it. And we see this we're working with 500 districts. The districts that have great transparent process are the ones that have the best acceptance of their ideas. The process capital that you can create is when people will just say, oh yeah, this organization has amazing process around the decision making. They're transparent about it. They're very public about it. That actually brings up capital that people will say, I'll support it. I hated their answer, but you know what? I really appreciate how they got to the answer, and therefore I accept it. The reason why this is important, I want to tie this in your mind to the disruption problem. And the disruption problem is that if your organizations, if you're making great decisions, if you have a great decision process and you're making good decisions, the chance of you losing students and their enrollment decreases dramatically, because those parents feel like, well, I was a part of the decision process, and it'll decrease the chance of them actually taking their students out and putting them in other districts because they actually felt like they were a part of the process, even if that process is taking things away from them. I want to emphasize that, even if the process is asking them about cuts. So the sort of questions you can ask yourself are, what are the major changes on the horizon as we head towards this remote economy or whatever's on the other side of COVID? And therefore, what decisions will we be making where we actually could meaningfully create more process capital? You can actually involve people in a shocking amount of decisions if you really take a minute to list out all the decisions where you could invite people in. Right now, people are reopening. There's districts saying, what are your concerns, thoughts, or questions as we're making plans for reopening? There's people that are doing funding scenarios, say, oh, we could do it this way, we could do it this way. I really strongly advise that a great playbook is whenever you have a major decision to make, try to frame it up as a couple of scenarios and then do neither of them. Do some blend between the two and say, we could do it this way, which is a little bit radical. We could do it this way, which is also a little bit radical. What are your thoughts about the scenarios? You get a whole bunch of feedback. You blend those scenarios together and say, you know what, in the end of the day, this is really, we've heard from people, we're not going to do either A or B, or sort of going with a C. The last one is, what do we need to consider as we make this decision? Notice that I haven't actually said what specific budget line items should we put in or not put in, to people that have no expert opinion on this. But you can ask people, what do we need to consider as we make this decision? Because if everyone either agrees or disagrees with you, you at least understand what people are thinking. And this is a fair question to be asking anybody as you're making important financial decisions. This last one I think is critical. And I mean, they're all critical, but this one is really critical. There was a problem that I used to soapbox about in the past around the difference between engagement and unity. And the idea is that ownership capital means you don't want to engage people. You want to unify your efforts with their efforts. This used to bug me in the past, and now you couldn't be caught saying this, but it used to bug me when school districts would say, hey, we want to engage parents in the education of their children. Because that just asserts that the parents are not engaged in the education of their children. And nowadays, of course, the district would never say, we'd really like to engage you in the education of your children, because frankly, they are educating the children in most places right now. And this would seem like a terrible thing to say. But also consider that it's always been kind of a accidentally bad thing to say, I want to engage you in education, because they're already engaged. Actually, what I want to do is I want to unify our effort with your effort. You're working really hard to educate your child. We're working really hard to educate your child. We want to make sure that we're on the same page about this. This notion of engagement just assumes a lack of unity between the other. So the notion here is that people support things they help create. It's a bit of a cognitive leap. It's a pretty easy thing to understand, but ownership capital is actually that I believe I am an owner in this conversation. And it's not limited to material things. Ownership can actually apply to points of view, but for people on this call, I think you'll appreciate this slide, which is that ownership also really applies to material things. And it's best in this moment in history, we do not forget that ownership does apply to things. And we also see a pretty strong correlation between districts that talk about students and parents as customers and use the words like constituents, and don't just call them parents and students, but actually talk about the constituents of the organization. You are the pieces that make it possible. You're not just a taxpayer, you're actually the customer of our services. And therefore, we expect that you would have a voice on this, because frankly, it's your money that's having this process work or not. The questions I wanted to unpack for you here, things like, as we plan the upcoming budget, what priorities should we consider? This doesn't mean we're going to necessarily consider everything that you put, but you know what, we're open to your thinking. The second one is hiding in plain sight, but it's really important. What are the most important skills experienced graduates need to attain? Why is this as a part of ownership capital? Well, because frankly, that's what the investment is about. This is what people are paying their tax dollars towards. This is what your employees are devoting their career to. This is why they get up in the morning, is to ultimately create the product of a well-rounded graduate that will be a contributing member of society. You have to have some level of agreement on what is the outcome. And the more you can ask this question, the more you can say, well, we made cuts in the following area because really we're highlighting, focusing on having as we've all agreed, our graduates are going to have the following skills, and therefore we felt this is the best way to get there. If you don't have agreement on the product, you really have a hard time agreeing on the process. And finally, what cost saving options could we consider? We're seeing tons of districts doing this right now. These are the very same people that are going to get stuff taken away from them, but they'll have more ownership of the process itself. If you're like, listen, as you know, we're heading in a recession, perhaps a depression, and before we make these cost savings things, we don't want to be the bad people. We actually want to ask people, so we want to encourage. I know we're painted as the people that are just taking money away, but frankly, we want to hear from you before we take money away. Okay, so this hierarchy, I'm just going to end on this idea, is that asking about culture and vision actually destroys all this leadership capital. This is on every one of our presentations, but I just want to triple down on it, is this idea of asking what's possible, etc., when you're not asking people what's wrong, actually destroys all that work you're doing, because they'll feel like you're out to lunch. And so you just want to make sure your organization is actually asking about challenges. What are the sort of challenges we need to address with the budget? And to unpack that, you really want to be able to talk about what's possible now that wasn't possible before. But from a human, if you ask today what's possible now, or what skill of the future require, people will probably say, hopefully, skills not to be racist. because they really need to talk about the bottom of the pyramid around safety and security, because people are not feeling very safe and secure in a lot of cities around the world right now. Okay, so, and we could talk more about that one. I won't belabor this one, but it's just an underpinning that we have about. And so this slide has changed slightly, but if you want to show people that you respect them, involve them in decisions that affect them. And this is actually the key that we've seen to people, helping inform, discovering ignorance in your planning process, creating great outcomes in your decision making. Okay, that's it.